that is perhaps the most iconic lineup of men's UFC champions this sport has ever seen. So much so that it actually had a name. It was called the Super 7, and we didn't know it yet, but their championship reigns were all in danger at this very moment. And many of them directly due to this exact question.
Well, we have a very interesting situation now that the UFC has acquired Strikeforce, and you have the opportunity now to possibly face an amazing group of talent that they have over there right now. Give us your thoughts on that.
The UFC has long been considered the world's greatest promotion with a roster of the best fighters on the planet. But is that really true? We've seen some of these other organizations' former champions cross over in recent years, but what about when three rival promotions of the UFC converged upon their weight classes all at the same time? And it came down to two key moments.
Is WEC merging with the UFC?
Yes.
UFC has purchased Strikeforce. Is that true?
That is true.
This certainly wasn't the first time the UFC had purchased one of their major rivals, most notably with Pride and some smaller acquisitions along the way. But what was different here was the absolute dominance that prevailed upon them. Pride, despite being the bigger organization at the time, did have greats like Rampage and Shogun become champion in the light heavyweight division. Big Nog at one point won the interim heavyweight championship over Tim Sylvia, but that was the extent of their championship impact once they got over to the UFC. A few other guys got title shots, but it just never really worked out on a major scale. Meanwhile, Strikeforce had become a true rival of the UFC by the end of 2010 with some of the biggest stars this sport has ever seen, and many of them already proving box office status. Not only that, but they beat the UFC to the punch with creating women's divisions. So this not only meant they could match the UFC's weight classes with their deep talent roster, but also add to it in many ways. And as I mentioned, Strikeforce was not alone here. The UFC had purchased another of their rivals 5 years before that with WEC, an organization that would produce the likes of Chael Sonnen, Carlos Condit, and Brian Stann before their merger, and eventually a ton more as the UFC began stripping apart WEC's heavier weight classes, leaving behind only the lighter weight classes, which included adding two totally new divisions to the UFC's roster, as well as their very own 155-pound weight class that would rival the UFC's for many years. And the reaction from the UFC athletes to all this fresh talent from crossing over into the world's leading promotion was, well, similar to what you might expect.
I personally wonder if he's in the right weight class, but he's been very successful at the minor leagues at Strikeforce.
There was some Tim Kennedy made some comments. Strikeforce middleweight 440. Tim Kennedy from Strikeforce.
Hey, how do you rank Strikeforce's heavyweight division?
The level of fighting in the UFC is superior to any other promotion, any other league, or anything like that you can even compare it to. There's no comparison. Maybe a step down. That's what I look at Strikeforce as.
While many other fighters were respectful, it definitely didn't help that in the years leading up to the Strikeforce purchase, Dana White had consistently talked them down.
Strikeforce is a lower level show where young, up and coming talent and guys that aren't in the UFC can go make some money. It's never going to be anything more than that, ever.
The reality is they're a small regional fucking company. They're a small little promotion company. They've been putting on these little fights up in San Jose. Strikeforce is not competition for us. They're not our competitor.
People love to play up the whole thing before, Strikeforce and that. Strikeforce is the minor leagues.
And well, we were about to find out if these criticisms were true. The WEC roster was up first, and pretty much all of these weight classes were new to the UFC. The promotion was gearing up for their historic first deal with a major TV network in Fox, and needed to bolster their lineup in order to provide more fights throughout the year. For instance, in 2011, when the Fox deal was signed, there were just 27 events, and by 2014, that had ballooned all the way up to 46 events. In short, they needed way more fights to fulfill their new TV schedule. And that meant these champions would automatically make the jump to the UFC with their championship belts in hands, or put immediately into title-winning opportunities. First up was Dominic Cruz, who took out Scott Jorgensen in December of 2010. He actually defended his WEC title that night at WEC 53, and that win meant simultaneously he was now the UFC champion. Then there was Jose Aldo, who memorably battered Uriah Faber's legs in the first and last WEC/Zuffa partnered pay-per-view. He was just plain promoted to championship status with the UFC before he ever had to compete with them. I mean, nobody was complaining. He was far and away the best 145er on the planet, and for the record, I think they should have done the same for Cruz. Meanwhile, the UFC would add a flyweight class that neither organization had prior, and so they would hold a tournament to determine the first champion. That ended up being Demetrius Johnson, who embarked on his record-breaking reign on September 22nd, 2012. And of course, the UFC had no women's weight classes prior to Ronda Rousey's meteoric rise, and so she was then promoted from Strikeforce's bantamweight champion to the UFC's in December of 2010, which was 3 months prior to actually fighting in the promotion and defending against Liz Carmouche in February of 2013. So at this point, nothing too crazy or surprising at this stage. No one in the UFC had been beaten for their titles, and that's because they were all new weight classes, so there was no one in the UFC for them to even fight. But of course, beyond this point is where things get really interesting. Going back to that lineup of the Super 7 in 2011, nearly all the UFC champions from that time by 2012 were still dominating the UFC's weight classes. It is perhaps the most iconic lineup of champions this sport has literally ever seen. Legitimate pound-for-pound icons that still hold their spots at the top of that list to this day. But in fact, in 2012, one by one, they all started to disappear. But it started with a bit of a swerve. By a strange set of circumstances, Anthony Pettis, who had just transcended the combat sports world with his incredible Showtime kick against Benson Henderson,
he ran off the wall like a ninja!
And therefore the final champion at lightweight for the WEC before merging with the UFC, well, he got stuck in limbo during this transition. The current UFC champion at that time, Frankie Edgar, had just put on an all-timer defense against Gray Maynard that actually ended in a draw.
They go the distance!
Wow. I thought I had that. I thought the belt was mine.
But I do think I won those rounds, and it was enough to win the fight. But it was close enough that the judges thought it was a draw, so we got to do it again.
I'm usually the first guy to go out and slam the judges, but we thought it was going to be a draw too.
What are you going to do? Are you going to give the shot to Maynard, or does Anthony get the shot next?
Gray Maynard proved tonight, you can't not give Gray Maynard this fight. You got to give this kid the immediate rematch.
Which meant that even though Pettis was guaranteed a title shot in the UFC, he'd simply have to wait. And this is where the swerve I mentioned happens because, well, he refused to wait for his guaranteed title shot. The guy was only 23 when he won the WEC belt and wanted to keep active, so he accepted what many considered basically a warm-up fight inside the promotion.
I was in line for a title shot after Clay Guida. I mean, I'm definitely focused on Guida, but I mean, the whole lightweight division is kind of stuck right now.
Now, Gray was kind of making some comments about you and said he's not really impressed. You were beating scrubs in the WEC.
I feel that he might be a little jealous of my level of success so fast. I mean, I'm probably the most popular UFC fighter that haven't fought in the UFC yet.
I'm going to show the UFC, I'm going to show Joe Silva, I'm going to show Dana White who the real number one contender really is, and myself.
It's the UFC. It's a big show. He's fought. He fought very well on his last big performances, the main event. So he's been in the big show for a little while, but he's about to find out what the Showtime's all about.
But it wasn't meant to be. Clay Guida would exploit Pettis' wrestling defense and shrug off all of his submission attempts to earn himself a unanimous decision over the now former WEC champion, which certainly seemed to affirm at the time that the UFC was indeed far superior. Guida had always been in amazing fights, but he wasn't really seen on the same level as a UFC champion caliber fighter, but he did just effectively beat the #1 contender for the title, and meanwhile, Benson Henderson had earned 2 wins off of Mark Bocek and a legit top contender in Jim Miller at the time. So just 1 month after Edgar would finally resolve his rivalry with Gray Maynard, we would have Guida and Benson square off. Sadly, the only way you could watch this fight back in the day was just on Facebook because of the UFC on Fox still. Well, the Fox execs opted to air only the main event, while 9 million viewers that turned into the broadcast were stuck watching a panel talk for an entire hour. So anybody who tuned in that night didn't even get to see this top-tier legitimate fight between Guida and Benson. A true classic, with Benson reasserting that the WEC guys were indeed worthy of a title shot.
For anybody to bitch about this fight and they didn't get to see that fight, shut up. You should have bought tickets then if you wanted to see all the fights and you don't like to watch it on Facebook. Seriously, shut up.
As far as putting on a worthy performance for UFC to want to air it, I'm pretty sure it's going to get aired at some point in time.
And so we'd get to see a former WEC champion against the current UFC champion in February of 2012. And honestly, this was incredibly close. Poor Edgar was in nothing but razor-close fights throughout his entire lightweight title run that ended with the first fights feeling so unresolved and basically all warranting rematches. And in the Benson rivalry, he would end up losing both the first and second fights by close decisions. If you ask me, Benson probably did deserve to win the first one, and I personally thought Edgar won the second one, but the judges saw it both times either way for Benson.
You know, it's one of those controversial decisions. And you know, let me just say this. I'm not a judge. I know there are a lot of people that scored the fight differently, but I tell these guys all the time, if you don't like the way the judges score, don't let it get there.
I felt I pushed the pace. I felt I brought the fight to him, you know, but here we are.
No matter your opinion on it, it definitely did prove that WEC was not a second-rate stable of fighters. They were in fact just as good as the UFC, if not actually better. And this would get proved in a bunch more ways too. For one, Jose Aldo would end up fighting and dominantly securing a win over not just Frankie Edgar in February of 2013, which was literally right after his Benson rivalry, by the way. He was still at the very, very top, and would be for many years. While Aldo would also beat a perennial top contender at 155 when he came down to featherweight with Kenny Florian as well. So, two weight classes from the WEC were proving dominance over the UFC's absolute best at a title level. And it didn't stop there, because the next division at lightweight after Benson, well, would you look at that, Pettis had completely redeemed himself and clawed his way back to the title picture and won it over Benson now in two separate organizations.
All that I dreamt about was getting that belt wrapped around me, and now it actually played out. Clay Guida took me down, wrestled me, stayed on top for 3 rounds, and I lost the fight. Man, just all the emotions came out. I mean, I worked hard to get this belt.
Between the two of them, they'd have 4 title defenses, and Pettis ended up losing to RDA in his second title defense attempt in 2015, which, by the way, was after he fought Strikeforce champ Gilbert Melendez for the title, who also challenged Benson in his reign. But either way, RDA was a UFC guy through and through, so the UFC won one back. But the very next guy now was Eddie Alvarez, coming over from Bellator, who finished RDA in his second title defense. And guess who RDA's only title defense was against? Donald Cerrone, another WEC guy. In fact, if you look at the UFC's lightweight division by this point, it wasn't just being won by outsiders, but it was being thoroughly dominated by them. Of the 8 title fights lasting from February of 2012 all the way to November of 2016, starting with Benson versus Edgar in their first fight for the UFC title, every single one of them had a WEC, Strikeforce, or Bellator fighter competing for the title. RDA was the only winner of all those fights with his 2 wins. The UFC was getting crushed here, but no matter how you look at it, that was just 2 divisions. How far could these outsider challengers really take this? Well, we're just getting started. The next would fittingly be the weight class just above lightweight, of course, welterweight. This was GSP's division while he was still on his goated run at 170 pounds. But by the end of 2013, rumblings began to make their way through the community that maybe he was looking to take some time off.
George isn't talking about retiring. His guys were saying, the guy who was like his mentor said, I'd love to see George win this fight and retire. That's who made that statement. George never made that statement.
And sure enough, after a very controversial fight where most did see him losing the fight at the time, I mean, fans who voted on the subject, journalists, fighter opinions, all calling it a robbery.
You and I were both surprised, as were a lot of people that I've talked to at the decision. Johnny Hendricks busted George up. He took him down. He had him badly hurt and stunned.
Does anybody here think that Johnny Hendricks didn't win the fight? Did you see George get smashed and hurt in the first round? It's about damage. Yeah, I'm blown away that George St. Pierre won that fight. I think the governor needs to step in immediately before these guys destroy this sport like they did boxing.
That was the note GSP left the division on. So the title would be vacated and it would be up for grabs with new challengers. In this case, it was of course Hendricks, who had just fought GSP, and an unlikely rise in Robbie Lawler, a former UFC fighter who, after going 1 out of his last 4 with the UFC in 2004, was out to fend for himself on the regional scene for nearly a decade. And after years of seeming deterioration, losing 5 of his 8 Strikeforce fights at middleweight, Well, most thought he'd put on some fun fights in the UFC, but that would probably just be the end of it. Somehow shockingly though, he'd end up taking out their welterweight division's best inside the UFC, including guys like Josh Koscheck and the heir apparent to GSP's vacated throne, fellow Canadian Rory MacDonald. Things wouldn't go his way against Hendricks in their first fight, but after 2 more wins against Ellenberger and Matt Brown, sure enough, he would get the nod in the rematch with Hendricks, which happened just under a year later, proving yet again Strikeforce was on the level with UFC's best and even surpassing it.
A lot of people wrote me off a long time ago, but I never wrote myself off. I always believed in myself, always thought that I could be the best.
And his reign proved to truly be a legendary one, with 2 of the best title fights of all time versus Rory MacDonald in their rematch, and not to mention WEC vet Carlos Condit. And if a former UFC fighter coming back isn't outsider enough for you, well, how about a fresh-faced Tyron Woodley who had never fought in the UFC before? He was the next guy to dethrone Robbie Lawler. Between the 2 of them, they would rule the UFC's welterweight division for a total of 5 years, from 2014 all the way to 2019.
No other mixed martial artist has had a comeback story like Robbie Lawler. He came back, he had a subpar record in Strikeforce. He had some great moments, some bad moments. Always proved everybody wrong. A lot of people didn't think I deserved this shot. They didn't think I should be fighting for the welterweight title, but I'm sitting here in front of you as the welterweight champion of the world.
And then skipping up a couple of weight classes, just a few months after Lawler would beat Hendricks in their title rematch, Strikeforce heavyweight tournament champion Daniel Cormier had successfully transitioned to light heavyweight and embarked on his epic rivalry with Jon Jones. In January of 2015, things didn't go exactly according to plan, and Jones would indeed retain his title. But wow, did things fall off the rails from here. First off, Jones tested positive for cocaine, of all things, following their fight, which is not really a surprise in hindsight, or honestly even at the time, because his good guy persona had already begun rapidly unraveling.
Hey pussy, are you still there? You're just the fakest person. I actually admire that you can actually be this fake.
But he would somehow manage to outdo a previous public DUI, and as already mentioned, that cocaine positive test, by another intoxicated binge that led to him wrecking into a pregnant lady, breaking her arm in the process, literally hit and running, only to come back to grab the drugs he forgot, and yeah, he was literally a wanted man.
John Bones Jones has been stripped of his title and suspended following his arrest in a hit-and-run crash here in Albuquerque.
The UFC have worked incredibly hard, and now we're here, we're on Fox Sports, It's in the mainstream, but as it sends a clear message that even the first guy on the Fight Pass prelims or the best fighter in the world, you're gonna be held accountable for your actions.
No.
Without a doubt, the most insane circumstances a UFC champion has ever been stripped of their title. So it meant Daniel Cormier would be up against #1 contender Anthony Johnson, a fight he pretty much ended up dominating, leading to this memorable corner moment.
Henry Hoof just yelled at him to man up. Don't give up, let's go! That's the last thing you want to have to tell your fighter. Don't give up.
What do you say to the people who say he's not the real champion?
Well, right now he is.
So yeah, this was 2015, and DC would never officially lose this title. Jones would come back, and it was thought he'd won it back with a head kick, but what do you know, he tested positive for PEDs. So yeah, the belt went right back to Cormier.
But the reality is, you can't fail drug tests. You can pass 100 tests, you cannot fail one. And then Dana White called me today, and he said, if it's a no contest, then the fight didn't happen. He said, the championship is getting returned to you. The fight is a no contest. If he cheated, he could not have fought and cheated and still won the fight. So once again, I'm the UFC champion.
And would last all the way until he went up to heavyweight and sure enough, KO'd Stipe Miocic. And yeah, that ended up being the next weight class in our timeline as well, but we have to rewind the clock back just a bit. Right around the time that DC was becoming the light heavyweight champion in the UFC in May of 2015, well, just 1 month later was another Strikeforce champion getting his opportunity at gold. And his story was similar to Robbie Lawler's in that he was a former UFC, this time heavyweight, who had notoriously been KO'd out of nowhere by Junior Dos Santos in 2008, and he found himself in Strikeforce among their growing roster. And to say the Strikeforce heavyweight division was competitive with the UFC's feels like an understatement. For one, they had the White Whale and a still undefeated Fedor Emelianenko going all the way back to when he was on top in Pride. They also had Bigfoot Silva, Alistair Overeem, Daniel Cormier, Andrei Arlovsky, who himself ended up in the UFC all the way until 2024. I mean, it was to the point that Strikeforce held a Giants Grand Prix for all the big men mentioned and then some that sent shockwaves through the sport. But that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Verdum, following that JDS loss in the UFC, would go on a tear in Strikeforce, taking out the likes of Bigfoot Silva and even becoming the first man to actually defeat Fedor Emelianenko, leading to wild comments like this from Dana White.
And people can say, oh, you got caught in a triangle, anybody can. You know, yeah, anybody can, but you're better. It would have been a lot better if you came over here and lost to Shane Carwin, Brock Lesnar, Cain Velasquez, than losing to Verdum. Those guys can't even make the fights. If Fedor should have been fighting Overeem, why didn't that fight happen? You know, he's fighting Verdum.
Then he goes in and loses to Verdum, a guy who we cut from the UFC for losing. Nobody cares.
And after a lackluster defeat at the hands of Overeem, a mythical roided to the gills fighter of the era, well, Verdum then finally made it back to the UFC. And from here, something special happens. From February 2012 to the end of 2014, he was taking everyone out, even subbing Big Nog. He even managed to TKO Mark Hunt, the former K1 kickboxing champion, for the UFC's interim title while the champion was out. And so next was who many saw as the greatest heavyweight the world had ever seen by that time. Cain Velasquez. And the story is infamous by now, but for whatever reason, even though they were heavyweights, Cain Velasquez and his team opted out of going to Mexico City to acclimate with the extreme altitude.
The proof is in the gym, what I've done in there, you know, so I felt great for this fight.
I stayed long time for my fight. The last time I stayed 2 months here. I have a lot of friends here. I have a lot of fans too.
Something that for the uninitiated means that the thinner air can be notoriously difficult to adjust to, being that high above sea level. Less oxygen basically means less energy. So this led to one of the most ironic fight moments in the sport's entire history, as the man called Cardio Cain was seen huffing and puffing after just a single round.
Cain Velasquez is breathing hard, big time. I think the altitude is playing a big factor here. I think he may have underestimated its effect.
While Verdum, who did train extensively in Mexico City, took control of the fight and subbed him in the third round. It was one of the most incredible career comebacks, right in line with Robbie Lawler's story.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But I'll tell you what, altitude kills.
And after some of the incredible wins he had amassed, especially against the true greats of his era, he was on everyone's heavyweight Mount Rushmore by that point. And of course, Stipe Miocic would end his reign and embark on his own legacy-defining championship reign, but notably losing to DC in the first fight of their trilogy, showing two Strikeforce champions at the zenith of the division. In fact, this started for Stipe with his title eliminator fight with Arlovsky, who was also coming back from Strikeforce. So then 5 of the next 8 title fights he'd been involved in from 2016 to 2021 were against Strikeforce guys. Ngannou twice and JDS were the only exceptions there. He'd fought DC alone as many times as those two. And then there was one single division left. Strikeforce, WEC, and Bellator had completely engulfed all of the divisions but one, middleweight. The last member of the Super 7 that we've mentioned as well today in this video, Anderson Silva, would ironically be one of the first to lose his title, Edgar the only exception. But by the summer of 2013, Anderson Silva was seen as the greatest pound-for-pound fighter in the world by many. 10 title defenses, even a short stint taking out former title holders at light heavyweight, and no real close fights outside of the first Chael fight, which was now 3 years in the rearview mirror. And the baiting strategy that saw him dazzle audiences and opponents alike around the world against nearly everyone in that 6-year title span had finally been used against him when Chris Weidman KO'd him as he tried to do the same against the New York native.
Oh my goodness! You can't play games in the octagon.
Things didn't get better in the rematch when a freak accident ended that fight too.
Whenever you see a guy like Anderson Silva falling down with his leg broken, screaming in agony, it was hard to watch. If he chooses to continue, he may not ever be the same again.
And from there, we saw Weidman rule the division for the next 2 years. Meanwhile, a surfer turned MMA fighter in Luke Rockhold had captured the Strikeforce title before moving over to the UFC. And many thought he'd create an outstanding style matchup for Anderson at the time with his own striking prowess, but also highly rated submission game. And training at the behemoth gym that was AKA at the time with so many then current and future champions, yeah, he seemed like the obvious fight for Anderson to many when he went to the UFC, but for some reason that didn't happen. Strangely, they decided to go with another matchup instead, Vitor Belfort. But not just any version of this man, TRT Vitor Belfort. For those that don't know, there used to be an exemption for fighters with clinically low testosterone to get a doctor's exemption for something that would normally be considered a banned PED, or as it was called at the time, testosterone replacement therapy.
There are people who really have a disease called hypogonadism, low testosterone level. That's what we can't miss. And some of those people are actually, or have low testosterone because they were shooting up testosterone and shutting down their own ability to create testosterone. We want to treat, as physicians, those people who really have a disease. But when you're actually creating the problem and using it for performance enhancement, that's the issue.
Vitor Belfort, who had already failed drug tests in the past, seized upon the opportunity and by 2013 managed to look more like an elite athlete in his 20s than the 35-year-old man he truly was. This led to him decimating Bisping to the extent that he essentially lost one of his eyes, absolutely rushing through Dan Henderson, and of course, against Luke Rockhold, pulling off a spectacular heel kick finish. So Rockhold's championship hopes would die and need to be reborn another day, but that would prove to be his only loss en route back to the title, besting the likes of Michael Bisping and even subbing former title challenger, and then still major puzzle for fighters in Lyoto Machida. This all finally leading towards his UFC title shot. And on a historic night with a surging Conor McGregor dominating headlines against Jose Aldo, Rockhold and Weidman's comparatively quiet rivalry bubbled just underneath the surface.
And then wrestling department, I have him schooled in. You know, people, I don't know why he gets credit for having good wrestling. He was a terrible high school wrestler. But when it comes down, I think I could be knocking him out in the first round. I think I could take him down, hit him with an elbow, and then look for submissions or ground and pound. There's just so many ways for me to win this fight.
As a former Strikeforce champion, you come over with that group that, some had doubted, hey, can they succeed in the UFC?
For your accomplishments to be beaten down and make less of what they really were, I came in with a point to prove when I came here. People still look at my biggest win as my last win as a Lyoto Machida. They don't realize my fights with Tim Kennedy and Jacare. Those guys were much tougher.
And basically, on Saturday night, I'm going to give this guy a reality check.
My reality, my confidence is rooted. He trains with a bunch of jabronis. I train with champions. His toughest opponent to date was one of my easiest.
And despite a horrible reoccurring staph infection, he would still manage to not only beat Weidman, but dominate him in his own domain on the ground in a fight that went on for far too long. And on that night, Rockhold closed the loop. By 2015, every single one of the UFC's divisional champions had lost to outsider rivals, and all nearly at the same time. When Rockhold finished Weidman on December 12, 2015, Verdum, the UFC reject and Strikeforce comeback vet, was heavyweight champion. DC, the Strikeforce heavyweight tournament champion, was UFC light heavyweight champion. Of course, Rockhold was at middleweight, Robbie Lawler was at welterweight, and at lightweight, RDA was preceded by 2 WEC champions and will lose only a couple months later to the underground king Eddie Alvarez from Bellator. And these were all the existing divisions by the time the UFC merged with WEC and Strikeforce. The lighter weight classes were all controlled by, of course, the existing champions from both of those outsider organizations, and for years, the likes of Yoel Romero, Dustin Poirier, and even Aldo at bantamweight, the Korean Zombie, or even longtime Strikeforce vet Jorge Masvidal were all getting title shots well into the 2020s, which tells you how truly unprecedented this moment is in the UFC's history. And since Strikeforce, there have been no major acquisitions by Zuffa to purchase a true rival competitor. Since then, other champions like Yuri from Ryzen, Drickus from KSW and EFC, Piotr Jan from ACB, Khabib or Moreno, who was the 16th seed on The Ultimate Fighter, where he was the WFF champion, have emerged as UFC champion, with countless others challenging for titles, or in the case of Justin Gaethje, earning interim championship and BMF championships. At some point, you have to ask yourself, does the UFC really have the best holding their titles at any given time? And we've seen this happen going the other way as well. And I'm not trying to say if the UFC were to purchase PFL that they would lose today. I would actually say that UFC's gotten stronger since then. But would it really be a shock after learning from this that at least one of those guys would win? Who picked Robbie Lawler to come back after a decade and a really mixed record to become champion? The guy who got knocked out by JDS, how is he going to come back 7 years later and beat the guy that beat JDS? Not only does MMA math not work, but it proves you can't contain it in this simple way with inside one organization. It's just a reminder that the old idiom is in fact true. A fight's a fight, and anything can happen. Thanks for watching, everybody.